Someone that is at 30% body fat is going to have to lose fat in a different way than someone that is at 15% body fat. And someone that's at 15% body fat needs to do different things than someone that is at 10% body fat trying to get shredded. And the unfortunate thing is, in the world of content, is we tend to rope it all together. We say, it's just caloric restriction, different varying degrees of caloric restriction, or this diet and that diet. And the bottom line is, you look at the literature and you see, well, shoot, people responded differently because there's different physiology at different levels of body fat. There's also different levels of maintenance and BMR and whatnot. Now, full disclosure, what's important to also know here is that how long someone has been at a certain body fat or body weight matters too, but unfortunately, I can't get that bio-individual. So we're just going to start with the 30% and we'll work to 15% and then we're going to work to the shredded piece. If someone is 30% body fat, what they need to do is generally different. Now, the first thing I will say is, yes, and this isn't going to be a popular opinion, aggressive caloric restriction is probably the most important thing. Getting the weight off of you as fast as possible when you are obese or have high degrees of body fat. That is important because the more that you are living your life at that level of obesity or high body fat percentage, each day that you're living like that, you are casting upon your body a cascade of adipokines and all kinds of inflammatory cytokines, and just it's not good to be at that level of body fat percentage for a long period of time. And we've seen that in the literature. No one's denying that, okay? Now, the problem is that when you aggressively restrict to get weight off you fast, you also have muscle mass degradation, you have unsustainability, you end up dealing with like having to combat against willpower and all these other things. So that really matters. So if we look at a study that was published in the, funny name, Handbook of Famine, Starvation, and Nutrient Deprivation, there was one particular study they looked at that looked at two given studies. Okay, it looked at two different sort of courses. One was an 8-week diet that had 45% of their calories coming from fat and 40% coming from carbs. The other was 60% from carbohydrates and 25% from fat, but isocaloric, so the same amount of calories, the remainder of course being protein, pretty low protein at 15%, but it doesn't really matter in this case because we're isocaloric and we're really looking at the fat and carbs more than anything. They found that they lost the same amount of fat, the same amount of weight, the same waist to hip ratio changes, right? So generally the same changes and the same muscle mass preservation. So it kind of tells us, well, it doesn't really matter what macronutrient profile. However, when we look deeper and we look at a study that was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, then we start to peek at some things that might matter when people are at like a 30% body fat range. So this was an isocaloric diet where the same kind of thing, they put people in a particular caloric range, but isocaloric, so they ate the same amount of calories, okay? The only difference was one was eating whole grain carbohydrates and one was eating regular refined grains. First of all, whole grain group actually lost more weight, but more importantly, they had massive reductions in insulin resistance. Why am I saying this? Okay, well, first of all, the fiber plays a role in glycemic response. It also plays a role in the microbiome, which we now know has huge implications when it comes down to body fat loss. Huge fat oxidation, glucose metabolism, all these things matter with the microbiome. But most importantly, what we're saying here is, if you ask a team of scientists sitting at a round table, which came first, insulin resistance or obesity, you'd probably be split 50-50. It's a hard discussion where people are like, well, obesity causes insulin resistance. Well, insulin resistance causes obesity. But one thing is commonly known amongst the group is that more often than not, when someone is overweight and has a high amount of body fat, there also is a decent amount, sometimes a lot, of insulin resistance. And the more insulin resistance that you have, the harder it is to burn fat. You could still lose weight, but insulin resistance in and of itself is going to make it, when you have high circulating levels of insulin, it's going to impede the actions of hormone-sensitive lipase. It's going to slow down lipolysis. So by and large, like, you could lose muscle mass, which puts you deeper in a hole later on. You might lose weight, but you're not going to lose the fat, right, as much. So what this means is that the quality of the carbohydrates you bring in start to matter more, when you are overweight. Yes, they matter more when you're overweight. That is what's wild. That's why you do see when people are super lean, they kind of can get away with a lot of things. Like I was filming with that guy, Bill Maeda. He's super shredded. He's like 55 years old out in Hawaii.
Always be a little hungry. So even though I might eat disgusting amounts of stuff, I'm never stuffed with those things. I'm never maxed out. I'll eat till I feel not hungry, or I might even be a little full. And then I'm going to just coast on that until I'm actually start feeling, I literally have to start feeling my kind of like my cheeks sucking in a little. And then I know I'm ready to eat again.
And he kind of eats whatever he wants, but he eats to satiety. He doesn't overeat. The point is, without digressing too much, he couldn't do that if he was obese. It would be harder, right? So some of it's like the phenotype already, but the point is that if you're overweight and you're super obese, the nutrient quality or the quality of the carbohydrates matters a lot. Also, I firmly believe, and this is my opinion based on lots of literature that I've read, that the more obese you are, the more sensitive you probably are to storing fat from carbohydrates. So I'm not saying carbohydrates are bad, but if you're insulin resistant, you're probably better off to reduce them. And no one's denying that. Again, that's so clear in the literature that yes, reducing carbohydrates can improve diabetes and can improve insulin resistance. If that is a secondary effect of you being obese, and it's also an encumbrance to you losing that fat, someone that is at 30% body fat would be in a good position to aggressively restrict calories and probably restrict carbohydrates. And the carbohydrates that they consume should probably be as low glycemic and high fiber as possible to aid in the gut microbiome. I also put a link down below for the probiotic that I recommend, because while we're talking about just the general microbiome and the impact that fiber can have and good quality carbohydrates can have, it's a relevant discussion. People always ask, when should I add a probiotic in? I usually say as soon as possible, especially when you're making a change. The moment you make a change to your diet is the moment you might want to add in good quality probiotic. That one down below is a 25% off discount link. It's for my favorite one that's called Seed. So it is a synbiotic, has a prebiotic and a probiotic in one capsule. So a multi-stage delivery system, really, really unique and cool formula. And they've got an abundance of clinical trials that they've published themselves. Highly recommend, no matter where you are, if you're making a dietary shift, to add that in. So that link, top line of the description, you'll see it says 25% off Seeds Daily Synbiotic. So check them out. Okay, so now we know that 30%, yes, keeping protein high, aggressively restricting. Don't worry about the speed in which you lose weight so much. Like, just get the fat off, because then things are going to start to look up. What about if you're 15, 17, 18% body fat? Like, you're just overweight, but you're not obese, right? How do you get down to that 10% range? What's different here? Well, first we look at a study published in the journal Trials. This was a great one. It was a 52-week study. So it looked at all of this, and it was looking at like, okay, what happens over the longer term? What they found is that caloric restriction was working super, super well in the beginning, but then towards the end of the year, it wasn't working as well. They either had to restrict calories super aggressively, or people just weren't responding at all. So basically this study kind of concluded that actually as you get leaner, the leaner that you get, you almost want to either do smaller caloric deficits long term, or infrequent caloric deficits that are more intense. It's almost like aggressive short stints, which can work for being obese too, but it's really working well for people that are just in that overweight category. But let's look at another study. This study was published in Current Obesity Reports. Fascinating study as well. This was actually a meta-analysis that looked at 13 studies, and this study was looking at the same percentage of weight loss, but over different lengths of time, right? So ranging from 0.2 kilograms per week all the way up to like 3 kilograms per week. And this study, again, kind of like when you look at all this meta-analysis, found that the lower the body fat you are, generally the slower the fat loss is better. So again, I reinforce, when you're very overweight, I don't think we need to be concerned with slow and steady as much. It's more like, hey, this is trauma time, get it off. Then as you get leaner, then it makes more sense to go slower and or quick and aggressive in separate stints, which I have another study to reinforce and explain this. International Journal of Obesity looked at something called intermittent caloric restriction, not intermittent fasting, intermittent caloric restriction. So they had one group diet for 16 weeks. So for 16 weeks, they had them on a pretty aggressive diet. Then the other group, they put on the exact same diet, except they had them go 1 week of dieting, 1 week off. 1 week of dieting, 1 week off. So it took 30 weeks, But the net caloric deficit, the total number of calories that were decreased, was the same as the other diet. They just did it over 30 weeks with 1 week on, 1 week break, 1 week on, 1 week break. The 30-week group lost more fat, a lot more fat. They also preserved more muscle and had better metrics overall. And you're probably wondering, well, yeah, they dieted for 30 weeks. No, guys, they dieted the same exact amount of calories. They ended up losing more, and it wasn't because they just stretched it out. It was because they took breaks. 1 week aggressive, 1 week off. 1 week aggressive, 1 week off. And I would put money on it that those people probably maintained their weight better. Aggressive short stints work well. They also maintain intensity of the diet. You don't wear out. You maintain that intensity and you can take a break and do it again. Intensity, take a break, do it again, right? So we see this in the literature, intermittent caloric restriction. It's like taking intermittent fasting, but not fasting, and just aggressive, not aggressive, aggressive, not aggressive. This seems to be very powerful for getting from that 15, 18% down to that 10% sweet spot, which is where I recommend most people hang out. Now, of course, you can always add G-Flux into the equation. Eating more, moving more. That's a great way to end up getting at that 10, 11% body fat. Just eat more, move more, and then you kind of ramp up your metabolism that way. And implementing that during the weeks that you're not aggressively calorically restricting, you're in a sweet spot. Okay, now for the ones that want to get shredded. You want to get below 10%. How does it differ here? The most important thing above all that I will say, and you could click off this video after you hear this because it's the most important thing, but I want you to hear more. Protein, protein, protein. The leaner that you get, the more important protein becomes. The leaner you get, the more important high protein becomes because you have less reserve to counterbalance. Less reserve, so you have to rely on that protein intake, first and foremost. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics published an interesting paper that looked at some stuff that would apply to this category of people. 13 randomized controlled trials looking at caloric restriction compared to intermittent fasting. And they found that, generally speaking, about the same amount of weight loss and fat loss, with the exception of two types of intermittent fasting, the 5-2 approach and the 4-3 approach, where you eat normal for 5 days and then aggressively restrict for 2 days, or eat normal for 4 days and aggressively restrict for 3. What this tells us is that the body becomes much better at burning fat in these extra short stints. So it's like when we were going from 15 to 10, we were going pretty short, like 1 week on, 1 week off. Now we're condensing that even more, where we're going like 3 or 4 days on, 2 days aggressive, almost no food, like just barely like 1 meal a day. The body responds well, but those meals need to be high protein. But let's keep going because that's just a vague outline of it. As you get leaner, the more meal timing matters. Does this stuff that I'm talking about right in this second matter for the person that's 30% body fat? It matters, but it's not going to be as noticeable. So this study was published in Obesity, and it was cool because they actually put people in a metabolic ward, an actual metabolic chamber where they could measure their substrate utilization, their fat oxidation, their glucose utilization, all these things that are super cool, right? So they took them and they had them eat at 2 different windows. They either ate from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m., or they ate from 1 p.m. to 11 p.m., and each group went to bed at 11:30. So one group ate shortly before bed, the other group didn't. Same exact amount of calories. And put them in a metabolic chamber where they could monitor them. The post-meal respiratory quotient was markedly higher in the group that ate before bed, meaning they oxidized less fat at night. This matters. And their overall energy expenditure was different. Flat out. They were burning carbs at night instead of fat while they were sleeping. And fat oxidation rates at night are actually a great testimony to like how people continue to burn fat throughout the day too. Your insulin sensitivity is going to be higher in the morning, which means that you're going to be able to burn through those carbs faster in the morning. So if you have them in the evening, they're going to sit there more. That's not the end of the world. I don't care so much about the carbohydrates. The sheer act of having food in your system while you go to bed matters. It matters for getting shredded. Does it matter for general caloric restriction? Not as much as you would think. Yeah, it matters long term, but we're talking about getting shredded. That's when meal timing matters. So what I mean with you for trying to get shredded is take aggressive short breaks from food. Like take a day or two of just strict reduction, and then the rest of the week, just moderate. And during the week where you're moderate, you want to keep your calories high enough and your activity high enough so that you have a good amount of energy flux, okay? And then during the days where you are not eating as much, you want to still train, but with a little bit less intensity, and have sort of those calories a little bit lower so that you can have that aggressive restriction. Again, probably a lot lower, like maybe even down to like 1,000 calories or less on those few days, so that it's aggressive and short, because your body can tap into that easier, and it's not something that you would want to sustain for a long period of time because it's so aggressive. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. See you tomorrow.